Three. All right, so welcome. I'm posting a brief overview of most of my notes. There's a little bit extra I'll be adding when I get to it, but this is the overall premise of what I'm doing. It's also pinned, so you can look at that if you want. So what I'm going to be emphasizing today is player choice, which is one of the main strengths of D&D, and tabletop role-playing games in general, and how to adapt to kind of make it work, and make players feel that the choices they are making are actually meaningful. Of course, Charlie, you can absolutely cheat off their notes if they provide them. So, first of all, when you're working with choices, you kind of want to first measure, all right, what type of choice is this? And there are three different scales I kind of think of them in. One of them is scale of impact. This is how much is this choice going to matter to my players? Not the characters, to the players, because sometimes it is better to aim for engaging the players than engaging their characters, because players, for instance, you may be dealing with a scene that is very tailored to one character and what they are invested in. Now, all of the other players may be invested in this scene because it is very personal and tied to what that character has been going through and all that sort of thing, but their characters might not necessarily be interested in that moment. So focusing on engaging players is usually a better strategy, and viewing characters as a venue of to get players engaged. So scale of impact is the lowest on this scale is players are actively disinterested. They can't wait for this to end. They want to move on and start doing something else. 2, players are apathetic. They aren't necessarily actively waiting for this to end, but they are very much not engaged in it, and they're very much this is okay, I guess. Then it moves on to players are interested and perhaps curious about the consequences. Now, with this, sometimes you can set this up by making the choice. You can build up the choice in front of them. In the example of the choice of who to back as, say, the potential heir to the kingdom, that's a choice that already has a lot of potential consequences that they are going to see pretty upfront. That the scale of that choice inherently makes it interesting to them. And however, if it's, hey, which inn do we stay at? Usually you have to do more work to make that interesting up front before they start diving into information about it. So with that, you can do something like making the two names of the inns very, very distinct. Having one inn have stories about ghosts haunting patrons, but prices are cheaper there. So, but the other one is kind of in the uptown area. Maybe they wouldn't like a bunch of adventurers coming and kind of ruining the atmosphere there with their road dust and homeless ways. After that, you want it be players are engaged and not just curious about what might happen, but actively invested in, I want this to happen, or I want to make sure this doesn't happen. In going back to the example of the heir, you could do that you could try and amp players up to this part by having one of the heirs be a real dick to them, just kind of an asshole, or having the other heir be someone who aligns with their goals, and the dwarf who's been working at getting his family out of slavery and saving enough money to pay for that. This heir actually wants to abolish slavery in the realm. That gives them a very close personal tie to their goals, or that character's goals at the very least, that makes them invested in a particular outcome of this. This means that they're now engaged in the consequences of other small choices that relate to making a choice of which heir to back, such as, okay, if we do political intrigue stuff, which choices are we going to make that are going to help this occur? And maybe if they are actively worried about which of these outcomes comes about, they will not only be interested in taking actions to support their favored heir, they can potentially also be worried about consequences of, oh, if we get caught doing blackmail, because we think the DM is devious and could potentially do that, or the circumstances allow that to be a potential outcome, that might actually do more harm than good, so we're actually going to hold back a bit. And because we are actually not just interested in being paid for helping him, we are actively interested in making sure he becomes the heir. The highest level is players are emotionally invested. They're not just invested because they think this would be an interesting story or whatever. They actually have an emotional connection to certain outcomes. And they have an investment in learning what's going to happen. And that also then becomes a great way to build tension, as well as to kind of guide players where you might want. If they're emotionally invested in the outcome, they are terrified of what is going to happen if, say, this Lich wins the war. Then he's going to come after all of them, right? They're going to both create a lot of memorable experiences because of the strong emotions linked to this particular choice, but they're also going to they're going to read a lot into what you're saying for cryptic hints about what is going on. Oh, wait, I think because he was talking about there being unrest over here, that means the Lich might be winning over here, so maybe we have to go over there to try and support the war effort, because if he just wins, then he doesn't have anything else distracting him from hunting us down for stealing that artifact, so we have to deal with that now. And so scale of impact is one of the big ways I measure that. This is something that how you're assessing that can change throughout the scene. So you have a beginning assessment of players are going to be apathetic about this, and then as you go into the scene and start presenting them with the choice, they then become far more interested or curious. So that's something you can kind of reassess on the fly really quick. But it's a good gauge of how much narrative time to devote to this. If players are interested and engaged in a choice, you spend more narrative time on that. If they are not, either move on or spend a little time trying to increase their engagement. But that's just essentially how I evaluate where I'm going to spend my resources as a DM. And description and time are both resources as a DM. There is only so much talking that straight up before players get to interact that they will tolerate or that they can and pay attention through. So that's a resource you are spending carefully. And similarly, time during a session is a resource. Someone is going to have something to do, bed to get to, or they're just going to have to go for some reason. So time is another resource. Scale of the choice. 1, the lowest on this is just personal. The only person this affects is me. After that affects you and one other person. And then 3 is small, all group of people. After that, it becomes large group of people, maybe a full county, a town, a nation. Scale of that can kind of vary depending on the overall scale of your world. If your world is never going to get, say the entire arc of your campaign is going to take place within one nation, the highest tier of the scale is going to be the nation. It is not going to be the world beyond that, but it is going to be the nation you are working in, because for all intents and purposes, the world I'm referencing here is the world at which the players will be interacting. So the highest tier of this is something that's just affecting all of that world. In the case of a nation campaign, they're super focused on this nation, this country, and what takes place within it. That would be killing a god or killing a king, or choosing the succession. Those are the world stage level choices. Now, players just people in general have an inherent weight that they will apportion to world stage events. The more people it affects, the more weighty that choice is in their minds. However, choices that stick with them often have more to do with things on the mid-tier of the scale, 2 or 3. Choices that have to do with characters they care about. And so intermixing the two and making, especially distilling the world stage choices into something that they also understand on a personal level. Oh, if I make this choice, if I kill the king, how is this going to affect the captain of the guard, who has been our friend for like the last 10 sessions because he helped us get out of jail. He was been a friend to us. He's someone we actively care about. This king is a dick, but killing him and changing this world scale, how does this affect this individual person? Even though this is a scale that's kind of linear, technically a choice can end up on multiple layers of that scale. And also, a choice that starts out on a smaller point in the scale, giving you pass by, for whatever reason your party's going to a mage tower. This is the College of the Mages, and there's a young sorcerer nearby who can't afford the entrance fee. The ranger's feeling generous. He got paid a lot, and unlike the rogue and fighter, he didn't spend all of his pay on drink and gambling the night before, so he decides, I'm going to be generous, I'm going to pay this guy's entrance fee. Now later, that sorcerer can end up being potentially saving the party, or has a natural talent which happens to be very, very important to saving a small town. Something like that is a small choice. It initially just affected the ranger and this sorcerer. That ended up affecting a lot more people. Those rippling effects make players feel, if they're well foreshadowed, if they make if they are well called back, if when the sorcerer comes, it's not just hey, it's the same guy you remember. Like, you're not describing that in a narrative way, as a side note. You are kind of throwing it in their face in the, thank you so much. It was so good to see you again. I never would have made it in here without you. I'm just glad to be giving back to you after so much time. Whatever help you need, I'm here for you. Something like that, which then makes it more personal, makes it not a side note, essentially, not an offhand thing. So especially acting out the scale of the choice, it can help make players care about it, make them feel like this mattered. Scale of change. This is essentially how much of a change occurred and how long. So momentary might be, I changed. So the lowest end on the scale is momentary. I chose not to shake this guy's hand. Right? He briefly glares at me and then moves on. There was no lasting impact for choosing not to shake the mayor's hand here. Or infinitesimal in the sense of I changed the color of my hair. Okay, that's a very tiny change. It doesn't. I went from auburn to like more brunette. There wasn't that much of a change there. Short term, or next up is short term, weeks, months, or small scale. These types of choices are things, or these types of effects from choices that players make are the ones that are more worth giving weight to. The momentary change, usually you're only giving a sentence or two of description to. It's going to slip. They might laugh for a moment or note it down because it was a funny moment, an interesting moment, but it's not going to carry any real weight with them as far as what made a really engaging encounter for them or what made a really engaging session for them. Something they'll remember afterwards. Short-term changes can do that, but though usually if the short-term change mattered to the players, it's because it was a something that was personal and players were really high on the emotional investment or investment category. Then personally long-term is years. Now, sometimes that can be hard to have an opportunity to display to players. So with that, a lot of what you're doing, if you're trying to communicate that, hey, this choice is something that is going to matter for years, unless your campaign is taking place on a longer scale, maybe you're fast-forwarding travel time, but travel times are really long. It takes a month for you to get from one end of, from one city to the next, that sort of thing. Or you have, say, 2-year breaks between, like, hey, what are your characters doing in these 2 years before you guys regrouped? If you're not doing one of those things, you kind of have to signpost that this is going to be. You have to tell players they're hearing people talk about this. They feel like there's going to be a change. They see the gears starting to move in the direction of long-term change. That sort of thing. In the case, an example is if you have this character in a small town who has been very, very discriminated against. They've been the stereotypical person blamed for everything, the witch that is blamed for all sorts of misfortunes and stuff, and you go and you actually free her from a curse. They find out, oh, she's not doing that sort of thing anymore. They actually start talking with her and begin the process of making friends, and she begins to not feel so lonely. That's something you can signpost by having like awkward first conversations with her. They see someone actually, even though after they do it, someone mentions, oh yeah, I'm heading out to go check up on her later today. Stuff like that is signposting that, hey, this is going to be more long-term. This is a change that is going to last. Just by small little callbacks to it. Ways to... and then you have decades long or affecting a large portion of the world. This is potentially this can be something like establishing a cult, something that is going to have a long-term effect on the religious makeup of a region for a long period of time. This has a little bit of overlap with scale of choice, or like just necessarily inherent scale. But on the scale of change, this also is how significant the change in makeup of the world is. If you made a new local goddess or god, it's a very, very significant change there, that even if it's local, even if it's just for this kind of small town or this region, potentially that has a really long-term effect that begins to ripple out to the rest of the world. That's where it would end up, higher on that scale. And then centuries and millennium long, those are usually things where you're dealing with complete or either creation of a new geopolitical entity like a nation, or destruction of one. Or if you are talking about supernatural things like gods, demons, angels, you prevented a demonic invasion. You trapped an angel here on Earth that is now going to, or here on this planet, and now they're stuck wandering the world for the next however long until they can get back. That's probably going to be a couple centuries or millennium. So there's going to be a long-term change there, but that's something that they as players are never going to see, except potentially as an epilogue scene or in a future campaign set in that later timeline. So the higher this goes on the scale, the more you need to signpost what is going to happen, because they're not going to be able to see those that effect. Any questions at this point? Things I explained really poorly, but you would like a better explanation on? Give everyone a moment to decide to speak up or not, or type up. All right. Okay, so that's some ways I do to measure, like, okay, really quick, when the players are making a choice, how much weight do I need to give to this choice? And most choices that players make are going to be fairly short term. The one thing I didn't touch on is, how does killing someone necessarily weigh on the scale of change, as I referred to it, which is the, like, how long / how much change. That one I find best most of the time I evaluate that one based mostly on the ripple effect that death is going to have, rather than, because technically you are removing their life. You are making something that has years worth of change in the world, based on however much life they had left, or based on butterfly effects, can go centuries, millennium, that sort of thing. But really, just I evaluate that based on the ripple effect. Okay, is this going to affect a lot of people for a very long time? Is this going to be short term? Oh, they call off the posse who's looking for this criminal. Okay, that was a very short term change. Stuff like that. So I touched briefly on it because first, when players are making a choice, you need to evaluate what type of choice they're making, how much impact this is going to have, so you can make them feel good or bad about whether or not that had the about the effects that choice has. But you also need to be able to evaluate how players are invested in that particular choice and what they think this choice is going to change. So the first part, or the second part of that, which is what do they think this is going to change? How are they evaluating it? Because so much of D&D and just good DMing is making things believable to your players. It's immersion. It's making this seem plausible. So if the ripple effect from the choice they evaluated, if the ripple effect that you are giving them is drastically different from their initial evaluation of that choice, you need to sell why that there is so big a difference. What was their unknown? What did they miscalculate? If it is something that, that artifact you picked up, that actually is something that's unleashed like a dark creature, some supernatural force that is now going to begin ravaging the world, they probably didn't initially think that was going to be a very big choice. And you are going to have a lot more work as a DM selling that was that choice that they initially thought was small scale is actually a very, very big one. That's most of where I find player discontent coming in, as far as choices, is when the effect of their choices is drastically different. It's either much higher than they thought or much lower. If they thought, oh, I thought it's similar to BioWare games have had this complaint on occasion. Oh, I thought the blue, red, and green choices were drastically different. I didn't think it was going to be 30 seconds of different cutscenes, or difference between the cutscenes. That sort of thing. So you need, if they think this is going to matter, it should probably matter at least a little. Or if it does, you're like, this still isn't going to matter that much, you need to, in some way, either narratively or out of character, you can eventually tell them why, if they become too frustrated, why this is not, this choice isn't actually going to matter. But the first part of this is like making players invested in figuring out how interested they are in this particular choice. It is based on the fundamental principle of knowing your players. Now, you are always supposed to know your characters too, but these characters are not your players, okay? They occasionally intersect. Hopefully they frequently intersect. Most people have more fun playing characters whose interests intersect with their own. I, for example, am a player who is super interested in lore and other people. So when I play a character who has zero curiosity about the world around them, I'm usually not having as good a time because I need to rely on other players making choices to get to the things that are more interesting to me, because my character doesn't have a reason in character to continually be chasing the parts of the game that will be more interesting to me as a player. Now, players will sometimes make characters that don't intersect with their own interests, but you're trying to figure out where they do. And so potential investment focuses can be characters, factions, mysteries, and goals. So characters are going to be individual NPCs that, these are not talking about their characters, usually. Choices that matter between two player characters are usually kind of handled between those players. Then you're not so much the arbitrator of what happens with those consequences as those players are. If I, in character, insult, say, Lionel, or Charlie is the one who's going to determine how much insult he takes from that, how long-term that effect on our relationship is, all that sort of stuff, not the DM. That's work you kind of don't have to do. You might have to figure out how an NPC who is closer to Charlie than to me is going to react to that, but you don't have to figure out how Charlie's going to react to that. So these characters, usually there's some broad categories people find in characters that they're going to focus on. One of them is a nemesis. So nemeses are enemies that have long-term goals, or maybe just paths. Sometimes their goals don't interline at all, or intersect, or oppose. But their travel pattern does. They're moving in the same direction as you, so they're going to cross paths over and over again. But nemesis are characters who players are going to be most interested in how a choice affects their ability to hurt the nemesis, or whether or not it's going to draw them attention from their nemesis. So figuring out what your player's current relationship is with that nemesis. Are they going to really care about this because it's going to hurt them, or are they going to be more worried about drawing his attention? Do they feel that power differential is too big right now? This is going to give a lot of this is going to give you a lot of ways to draw the party in one direction or another. You're not railroading, but you are making this path or this general direction desirable to them, because they know choices I make in that direction are going to be meaningful in a way that I currently know and understand. If I go off in this other direction that the DM gave 2 sentences of description to, if I go if I go explore this mysterious forest with mist and all this other stuff, instead of going investigating this factory with all the slave workers that I know is owned by my nemesis, then I might find something interesting, but that's not a guarantee. I know for a fact if I go over here, I'll find something related to my nemesis, this enemy character, so I can go over there. Now, comic relief characters are characters that players sometimes players just find really amusing. They laugh their asses off whenever he or she shows up. They can't wait to see what this character is going to do next. Now, sometimes it's like a silly voice. If I have a lich that sounds like Mickey Mouse, then they're going to treat this as a comic relief rather than a nemesis most of the time. Or it's a character that is funny for other reasons, slapstick. The skeleton whose head keeps falling off and needs to take a moment to find his knee, because that sort of thing. Comic relief characters are ones that players usually, even if the characters don't like, the players are interested in keeping alive, keeping safe, and if they change personality briefly, or begin to feel, not personality so much as attitude, if they begin to move away from that comic mode, that then becomes a source of interest for players, because they want to return them to their normal comic state. This is a character who is normally cracking all the jokes, super sassy, is now kind of dour and sad, and not, when the barbarian insults him, he doesn't actually snap back with a witty comment. He just does and keeps drinking his beer. They're going to be intrigued by that. They're going to try and make choices that will bring them back to center, back to where they're familiar. If the at least broadly speaking, obviously specifics, you can make characters who are an amalgamation of any of these types of NPCs and have very, very specific relationships with characters and with players that are far more nuanced. This is a broad overview based on my experience. Allies. These are characters that people don't necessarily care about individually, but they care about the fact that they can help you. Okay? That is the distinction I'm giving here. A friend is someone that the players are emotionally connected with. Now, a friend might be an ally in the sense of they can contribute combat expertise, they can help you mechanically, they can give you they can make you potions for free, stuff like that. But an ally is someone that players care about mostly because of the mechanical choices, the mechanical impact, rather than the role-playing impact. So with allies, the players are mostly going to care about how much the choices they're making with relation to them increase the allies' willingness to help or ability to help, or decrease it. They are worried about offending them or losing their ability to help. So if you have the distinction between these two types of NPCs might be if you have this young sorceress who's actually been kind of an on and off, a protege of the wizard player. They care about them. They think of them as a friend. Giving them the gift of a more powerful staff, the player might not even care if it's something that might actually be more useful for the wizard as a player character. They might just be interested in the fact that this is going to have a strong emotional reaction from that NPC because it is a gift from someone they view as a mentor. Versus the ally, if that character was just an ally, if this was just a sorcerer that could help you and did help you guys occasionally, the mechanical impact of the change in their combat effectiveness is more of what players worry about, so they're going to just give it to the wizard because their wizard can use it more effectively anyways. And that's how you can... That's a way to anticipate what choices players are making, as well as when you're offering them the choice to do something, figuring out whether or not they're going to care about it as much. With allies, mostly mechanics, friends, some mix of the two. Love interest. Now, a lot of players are not going to be interested in this. This is not something they want to roleplay, or it is something that their characters are not interested in at the moment. And even then, a lot of times players really want to have that between themselves and other player characters. They don't want to be romancing NPCs. But when it does happen, they care about a whole lot about that. That's one of the more complicated types of NPC character relationships for you to try and navigate, like, choice minefields about. It's not a BioWare game. It's not they just give them gifts and things turn out positively. In that you're kind of role-playing a relationship between the two players, or between two people, and figuring out how to make that, how to sell those choices, mostly just is going to be how well you can role-play that character. If you're really good at voices, selling the reaction, selling their personality, their attitude, and maybe ethics, morality, philosophy, whatever else that is something that this player interacts with very consistently, that's more of what they're interested in getting out of a choice. So then whether or not it's whatever mechanical effect it's going to have, and usually they're a little afraid of pissing them off, but sometimes love interests have a kind of adversarial relationship. If they're the two that bicker constantly, are sassy as hell towards each other, then they might actually be actively trying to court sassy comebacks and one-liners, that sort of thing. So in that case, sell that. If you want to make players care about the choices they are making with relation to that, give them a lot of that. With Shopkeeper. Shopkeeper is essentially any NPC that they're mostly relating to their wearers. They're characters that show up selling magic items, or show up selling health potions, or just they're someone who they mostly interact with in the way of someone who is trying to sell them something. Now, this character often has a overlap with ally or comic relief. However, because they are not necessarily, the mechanical benefit they can have, they can give you, can still be offered even if they don't like you, or even if you're blackmailing them, threatening them, that sort of thing. Players will often make choices that are just related to either, if they're very interested in the personality of this character, they'll make choices that are interact with them as comic relief, or they'll make choices that are mostly, how do I get this person to sell me these things at a cheaper rate? And that's a lot of what they'll care about. Sometimes that will develop later into a character who is a friend because they spent time developing a relationship with them that is positive, and getting cheaper prices that way. But a lot of times they're just, that's what they're doing. Then there's employers. Employers are people who are offering you quests, or story things, or they're paying you. Sometimes an employer isn't actually ever going to pay you. They're just going to tell you constantly about quest hooks and allow you to go herring off in those directions. These are people that a lot of what player choices were in relation to these are going to be is just going to be, how do I get more options here or more information about a particular thing? If they are someone who's in charge of paying you, then it's also going to overlap somewhat with the shopkeeper, where it's, what can I do almost by any means necessary to make this character or pay me more, whether that's another magic item, whether that's giving me political influence, or it's gold. Mostly it's gold. Any questions about that? The character section. As a side note, the character relationships, so player-character relationships to these NPCs also matters a whole lot. But those are things that will kind of depend on the specific nature of that relationship. So say this character is a nemesis, but they're also this character's brother. Then choices about redemption and a lot of other stuff then come into play that becomes a lot more nuanced and a lot more complicated. But most of those are going to be specific campaign to campaign and character to character, rather than these broad categories that I can try to give advice on. So when you're giving an ally, so factions are going to be groups of people, anything from knight orders to druid circles to cults and religions. Ally factions people care about usually as their well-being. What's the identity of them? Are they getting stronger? Factions, usually players want to learn more if they as a player are interested in learning about lore. If they're interested in lore, if they're interested in some of the specifics, if you leave a lot of questions that to be answered, like what the heck is this Knight Order's armor made out of, and why does it reflect fire? Why does every time fire or these dragons or like these cultists who were using fire breath potions attack them, why does that end up doing nothing? What's going on here? Leaving questions like that for people to answer, they will then they then become very interested in choices that will reveal more. Also, choices that increase your relationship with a faction rather than specific character. Hey, I'm getting closer to these guys. Giving a good way of selling that in a crowd is by giving a lot of brief in-character or comments or descriptions of physical gestures from members of that faction. So saying, after you've just been awarded a medal by an order of knights. Knights are an easy example, so that's why I'm using them as far as allies go. As you're walking down the hall, this scarred and bearded knight who they've fought alongside several times, claps them on the shoulder and gives them a stern nod. They haven't heard him talk much, so they already know that doing that much already means something to them, more so than even giving words would. They also hear their names being called out, and maybe a couple of cool titles if they're like the hero of Meadshire or something like that, is the title of one of the characters. Then hearing from the crowd, "All hail the hero of Meadshire!" Stuff like that makes the choices that they made leading up to this eventual moment feel really meaningful. They're receiving a lot of positive feedback from that. For enemy factions, a lot of times enemy factions are factions that players do not want to be allies with. They're okay with having an enemy at this point. So I'm going to go through that case first before I go into an undesired enemy or an unwanted one. So, enemy factions, you want to sell how much they either hate, fear, or just kind of disrespect the players. Usually, if they're disrespecting the players, it's because they're low level. The players are low level, and this faction thinks they should have no business meddling with them. Okay, selling that like insults that you know are going to needle them, but not necessarily go too far. You do not want to. You do not want to make the players feel bad, right? So if you're going with these enemies just don't respect you guys, make that something that can change eventually. And so choices that they make to become respected by these enemies become something they value tremendously. And when they happen, when they make choices that should reasonably make them respected and or feared by that faction, you need to sell that. You need to sell that there has been a change in the relationship, and you've managed to earn their respect. Sometimes they're now sending elite assassins after you. They're the mooks turn and run when they see you enter the building. Stuff like that, or oh shit! It's the heroes of Remnant. No, go out the back door. No, I'll hold them off. You run now. All right. Stuff like that, where you're selling it, role playing, description, all this other stuff that needs to be there for. Hey, the choice you made to try and earn their respect, earn their fear, paid off. Or if they want to keep using that and being like, hey, all right, they don't respect us, we're going to play into that. We're going to keep being the people that you don't respect, whose competence you question, and yet we're still kicking your ass. Then play into that. Have the bad guy scoff and like draw his belt knife instead of his sword when he goes to kill them. I'm not even going to need this. Having that, for that, a lot of what players want out of that, the reason why they would make that choice, is that moment of surprise, that moment of, you were more than I anticipated, and selling that moment as both comedic and as well as like a, oh no, like it's too late, like saying, as you laugh and knock the knife out of his hand and thrust your own into his heart, you see his eyes go wide and his face goes white with fear. As he clutches desperately for the hilt of his sword still hanging at his waist. Stuff like that, where you're selling that this was a element of surprise and that they did underestimate you. It's not that you got necessarily, unless this is the tone you're going from the campaign, in which case there's a lot of other more specific stuff I could probably say. But unless you're going specifically for the band of misfits that are super, super under the power level of everyone they face, most of the time you want that surprise factor. That is what they're going for with that particular sub-route of when they're making choices. Like, that's the aim of their choice. And with that, they're going for they're engaged and invested in particular outcomes. So if they are doing that, they're caring about that. If they are not at all engaged in any of the outcomes for these factions, ways of trying to sell them on, like make players engaged on it, are making the faction interesting to them. If these players really are interested in dark, gritty, and kind of shades of gray things, then you make the bad guys more sympathetic, and give hints that there's things there to respect or perhaps admire, even if you don't like their end goals. And then for good guys, you can make them hints of darkness beneath the surface. Sentences that keep getting cut off, but the other half of that be really interesting if they would ever or convince those knights to finish talking about it. Stuff like that. And especially making the factions be visually interesting. A lot of, when you are dealing with group identities, their visual identity, whatever links them together that way, is usually really, really important. So in the case of cults, who often don't have any other signifying thing, because they're most of the time normal civilians above ground, make their symbol something that is intriguing, fascinating. What does that mean? Why the heck do we keep fighting these like random townspeople who try and turn on us with knives with the Ouroboros sign in their skin? What is that? What's going on with that? Similar to how I was talking with allied factions, hey, what does this work here with their armor? How does that work with the knights? Making that a visually interesting thing where perhaps the armor actually captures the fires. So fire is breathed at them by a dragon, because they're an order of dragon hunting knights. So their armor actually captures it, and you see the fire moving beneath almost as though within the steel. The reflection of this polished steel seeming like a mirror that reflects nothing but flame, angry, hungry, and furious at being caged. Stuff like that. So we're making the visual identity of them very strong is really, really helpful for making an immediate investment from players and investment interest. With legendary factions. Legendary factions are things that... These are mythic scale. These players interact with these a little differently, whether they're ally, enemy, or neutral. In a lot of cases, they're going to be neutral. Just because they are legendary, they are something that is not... there is an element of awe in interacting with them, or there should be. Or at the very least, curiosity and desire to see them being really cool or badass. This can be, for example, most D&D settings have archangels or angels as a faction, broadly speaking. So seeing angels in person, particularly as a group, means, oh boy, they're dramatically... They're interacting with them dramatically differently than they are with a mortal faction that happens to be allied with, say, heaven or the forces of good. And a huge part of that is both their visual identity, because angels look powerful, mysterious, and also very alien. Or at the very least, very powerful because of glowing white. Maybe you go with the version that has the hundreds of eyes on their wings and stuff like that. Then you're leaning more towards alien. But they're very much treating these as things of legend about which they want to know if certain things they've heard are true. Are some of the assumptions they have as players accurate? They're going to want to know, oh, hey, are these angels do they look humanoid, or do they look a little different? Do they have golden glowing swords? Oh, that sort of thing. Curiosity is going to be usually, if you've done a good job setting them up as a faction, is going to be your immediate reaction. So with legendary factions, the biggest part of their immediate reaction is going to be how well you foreshadowed it. Hints in lore, hints about legends, rumors, all that sort of stuff. And the visual impressiveness of their initial entrance. A faction you have never heard before, but strides... If these... say you've never heard about centaurs before. There was no hint about that, no rumors, nothing at all. But when you initially meet them, you see beams of light strike the ground, and leaving this charred circle as this equine form strides forward, and with a single blow decapitates the giant you've been fighting as he leaps overhead. And as he turns to face you, his sword begins to shimmer and reform from this long great sword into what looks like two short swords that he then takes apart, each with green scales kind of shimmering in the steel, as a snake's tongue hisses out from the tip. It's a very visually impressive entrance that immediately inspires curiosity from players, even if they've never heard about centaurs at all before. They have no idea what they are in this world, but they've now been told, just through descriptive language, that, hey, these guys are kind of powerful, they're interesting, and they're very much not normal. They very much do not have traditional means of transportation, unless in this world everyone's traveling by light, and they very much do not have traditional weaponry. Unless, again, if that is something you have described before, then you are actually making a connection between that and something else. And then, afterwards is Own. By Own faction, I mean a faction of which the player characters are a member of. So, player characters are usually players are usually pretty interested in factions they are a member of. This is whether they start as a member of it, or whether they become one later. So, if they do that, they probably have a lot of questions that are going to need to be answered pretty quickly about it. But choices that affect their standing within that relationship, or within that faction, matter a whole lot to them. That element is going to affect a lot of choices they make, more so than just ones that directly affect other members of that faction. So if you are, say, the member of a Knight Order, you are going to care very much about choices that affect your reputation for taking challenges, and choices that affect your reputation for whatever else your orders and edicts are, because those affect your relationship with your order. And if they want to break away from that, that's going to be something that's going to be very... Then they making those choices deliberately, selling that as the order does actually care about you breaking away, making that choice matter to them as something like, oh, this was a choice that I made. I wanted to break away from them. This was a choice that... And you don't want to be punishing with that, but you do necessarily want to make them feel like that was a choice. Making that choice had an effect on my character and on the world around me. So, with that, you want to have, if they choose to leave the order, some authority is stripped from them. Some of the benefits that they got for being part of that order are publicly, or at least vitriolically, stripped from them. By vitriolically, I mean this would be if you were, say, leaving an order of knights because you violated their edicts. People are going to very much dislike you. If you're being removed from it for cowardice, maybe that's a more quiet, subdued scene where you're stripping them from the order. Where none of the other knights will meet your eye, where a hush hangs over the crowd. But regardless of kind of how you choose to handle that, making advancement or I can't think of the word right now. It's going down in... If your advancement or going down in rank... should matter, and you need to... These players are going to be invested in that. So selling that, hey, when they choose to do that, this matters, is worth the investment of your resource of description and time. which is one of the things of like why, as far as Remnant specifically, demotion. Thank you. I am not the clearest thinker today. That's one of the reasons why on Remnant specifically, leaving the guild or joining the guild of Remnant, the Adventurers Guild, should be a thing that matters. Selling that as a choice that you are making that gives you membership into a special club or costs you something, that choosing to leave the guild is a statement which changes your relationship with Alice, with other guild members, and with Sal as the owner of the inn we stay in, that most of us stay in at least, means something. So that's one of the reasons I very much like playing into those sort of scenes. I like to... I've played more with the leaving scenes, or when people want to go talk to Alice about, hey, I had an interpersonal problem with another guild member. I want Alice to come solve it. That's playing into the nature of your membership in this faction, and making that feel important. So, real quick, I keep getting a red bar on Discord saying, hey, your connection's not very good right now. Can everyone hear me kind of clearly? Am I cutting in and out a lot? Anything I should go back over? Ugh. At least I have a local recording, so on YouTube it should be just fine. Alright. Anything I should go back over because I've cut out? I know I'm repeating myself a lot.
I hear you okay. I'm just doing dishes, so I can't, respond quickly.
No problem. Alright. So, and then unknown. I kind of covered some of the ways to get an unknown... players interested in an unknown faction, at least immediately upon meeting them, when I was covering legendary factions. Other ways to get unknown faction. So unknown faction is someone, they don't know if they're an ally or an enemy. They have they have very little context for what their place in the world is. And usually, when they learn about them, it is because their goals intersected, and the players received mysterious help or hindrance from an outside source. Or the other really common thing is, hey, go solve a murder mystery. Hey, what's this weird symbol that keeps showing up everywhere? Hey, why did you see this weird dead guy who has that symbol on his forehead? That's one way to introduce a faction, and a really, really, that's a really common trope, actually. But unknown factions, when you first meet them, should have a couple of big questions about them, rather than just, hey, there's people that you know nothing about. There should be some very specific things that you don't know that players should want to know, and this is going to help make them interested in interactions with that faction, as well as interested in the consequence of their choices with relation to that faction. If this faction, say, the players are trying to steal something, during the heist, they see this artifact actually get stolen by someone else, someone from an unknown faction, say someone wearing an owl mask. They want to go after this owl mask faction, and they want to go do it to retrieve this artifact, or to get revenge for not having retrieved the artifact. So they automatically have a couple of very big questions there in the first place. What do they want it for? Why did they come at the same time as us? Do they know anything about us? Those are like 3 example questions that players might really want answered with regards to them, that you can use as signposts for, hey, players, if you go this way, you might learn a little bit more about this. Oh, all right, players are going to try and make choices to go in that direction. Stuff like that. This also ties very neatly into mysteries. There are, broadly speaking, 4 big types of mysteries in a campaign, which players will be curious about, or you would like them to be curious about. Who, what, when, and why. Now, usually, these are with regards to specific events. Okay, someone stole the heart of the tree of life. Okay, this is kind of the for those who have seen Moana, it's kind of like that. But if you didn't know who the thief was, that's a big mystery for the world. Is who stole that and why? Why did they do it? Then you also get into things like what and when. Where is it? Where is actually a 5th one I forgot to add on here. But so who is going to be either who is someone or who did something. So when players are deeply invested in who did something, this is usually because whatever the event that someone mysterious was involved in, it had a very big impact on either the world or the player characters. Now, if it had a very big impact on the world, that is a fundamental question that's probably a big arc of the campaign. If it has a big impact on a player, that's going to be something that an arc that they can pursue kind of at their discretion, but you can choose to signpost, hey, I'm ready to run that now, because now that character is showing up or something. Example, I've had a player who gave me the hook as a in their backstory of when I was on my way to colonize this new land. I was actually shipwrecked, and someone, I don't know who, someone saved me. And when I looked back, someone pulled me out of the water and put me on a plank of wood, and then dived back in to go look for others. I don't know if they made it. I don't know if they are alive, but I know someone risked their life to save me and then tried to do the same for others. And they then, after the storm, they wake up, becalmed on an island, whatever. I believe they actually showed up on the mainland and then were rescued. And a couple of other people were rescued, but no one that they knew as being the person that did this. So they had a big burning question that was something that I was able to play with later of who was this person who saved my life? And it was something the player didn't know, but the player knew that they wanted an answer to. For things like that are very personal, usually go to players' backstories for that. They'll tell you those kind of upfront and explicit, or they'll develop over the course of a campaign. And when those moments happen if that had happened, say, during a storyline, because you were like, hey, I don't necessarily, this is a shipwreck that I need to have happen and all the players are on it, but I also need the character who's failing all their swim checks to not die. Okay, I'll have a random NPC come save them. That then, and they then are like, who saved me? Like, I really want to know that. You can write that down as a plot hook you're going to use later and something they're invested in. What is going to be like, what is this? What is, I've seen this strange green web, in the forests, and it disappears whenever I try to get a closer look. What is it? What is it? Things like that are going to be very big, like very good ways of building tension for and building up curiosity. The more something like that appears before they get the answer, the more they're going to care about the answer when it is given to them. People don't care quite as much about something that is only a mystery for one session so much as they do about something that they keep getting slight clues to over the course of 2 months. However, at some point people need to get answers, and a lot of the trick to getting players invested in mysteries is making sure that the answer, at least the initial stages, the answers to these questions give them more questions. Not because they weren't genuine answers, but because this level of detail makes them more interesting, more intriguing, and they need to now have, or whatever this thing is. An example I would give is the trials I have been running for Emerald involved a mysterious order of knights involved with the elementals. These were druid knights. Now, that already being an incongruous thing, Emerald and other players were super curious about what the heck is going on with that initially. I have been slowly giving answers for that over time to some of the questions of, wait, who were they? Okay, what were they? Emerald now knows, like, okay, they each had a weapon associated with 2 elements. Okay, that's interesting. Why? Like, that sort of thing. She knows the name of the culture they came from and that they were mostly elves. That also gave her a whole lot of questions, especially in the way that was given. Stuff like that is good ways of making mysteries something that people are really invested in. It's just that sort of chain of questions that should, and very much should, have an answer to it at the end. The ambiguous answers, the like, hey, leave you without a concrete answer sort of thing, that is a better solution for not necessarily grand mysteries that are not. That is sometimes a good solution for grand mysteries, but that is a good response to questions that aren't things that players spend the majority of the campaign or several sessions worth actively pursuing a very specific answer to. They're going to feel cheated most of the time if they're given that to something that was, for them, a through line for their experience. And then goals. Goals, personal, group, and global. Personal goals are character goals. They are things that are tied very specifically to your character and what they want, and those are things they are invested in. So when someone is changing one of those goals, or you're saying, hey, I would like to fulfill that goal, the level of detail you give for that and how you're selling it, essentially the resources you as a DM are choosing to expend on that, matter a lot because they have a tremendous amount of impact there. When the personal player goals are being fulfilled or being thwarted, if they are, you reach a point where you're like, I was going to save my farm, and you come back and they already burned it to the ground, that can be a tremendous deflation rather than a moment that builds to a crescendo of vengeance or forward motion towards something. And if you're doing that, you kind of need to spend the resource of description and time to make that something that has weight proportionate to the amount of build-up this has had. Because some personal goals are fulfilled fairly quickly. You get through them in 4 weeks to like 6 or 7, assuming you have 1 session a week. Others, you spend 2 years and you just got to it. So recognizing how much buildup there has been and how much expectation there is for this is pretty important. And then group goals are things like Vox Machina's getting a keep, Vox Machina's destroying Vecna. Those are goals that they have that when you want to fulfill those, or thwart them again, you very much want to spend resources and make those matter, because again, they have a tremendous amount of impact because players are deeply invested in those, especially group goals that tie into all of the players. Sometimes group goals have one or two players that are left out. There's one character who's just along for the ride. They don't actually care about defeating the big bad. Stuff like that. Global goals would be something like world goals or nation goals. These are things that the player characters and the group share, but they are not necessarily unique to them or as personalized. For example, in Moana, the world is slowly, the islands are slowly dying because of the heart of one of the islands, the sort of mother island, a goddess, has been stolen. Returning that is a global goal. Even though Moana as a character shares it, and the other characters she meets share it, it is a goal shared by most people in that world. Now, these global goals are things that, when they are fulfilled, should have at least a 4 or 5 on the scale of the choice, as far as what their impact is, especially in the way that players choose to interact with the fulfillment of that goal. And they probably have they're probably really high on, hopefully, on the scale of change and the scale of impact as well. These are things that are going to matter to everyone, and they are heroes for having fulfilled it. Sell that. Make them feel like heroes for having done it. Or if they fail, if they move in the opposite direction, mostly this will happen more in home games and stuff like here on Remnant, because global goals for things on Remnant are not going to be common, and failing global goals with these sort of impacts those tend to have, usually not going to happen either. But if you happen to, say, fail to defeat the big bad, say you TPK in the final boss fight, making that moment feel weighty, making that moment feel like something that could have has a tremendous impact on the world, can make a memorable story that is worth having out of a moment of failure for the players. I know the half-hour epilogue that was us just dealing with it as we were playing NPCs after we TPK'd in the final boss fight for like a 3-month-long campaign. We played NPCs who had to deal with that, the consequences of that for a while, and that was like a half-hour thing that was after that session. We were NPCs 2 months later dealing with the occupation from this undead dragon, and we felt engaged with that. We felt like, oh, this is an interesting story. They weren't going to kill them without our help. We mattered. Our choices mattered. Now, we didn't make it. We didn't succeed. But that, still having done that, giving that epilogue made all of our choices up to that moment feel much more impactful, much weightier, and much more worth having had. So, any questions at this point? I know we're slowly dropping people. None? None at all?
Hello.
Hello.
So I was wondering. I mean, I guess I feel like I know what the answer is, but is there any way to, for lack of a better term, quickly size up a group you're DMing and figure out what can engage them?
Yeah, if you have the time, ask them. Really, there's a lot of common paradigms as far as like player classifications, like the lore nerd, the tactician, the power gamer, that sort of thing. I don't ascribe to a lot of those, partially because my college play group, every single one of us fits every single description in there. We all like combat, we all like power, like doing builds, we all really like lore and role playing. We do all of it. It's not as helpful, but saying some really easy, quick ones are: if someone is a paladin, ask if they are a member of an order or if they're independent. If someone is a fighter, ask really quick, hey, what type of fighter are you? Are you like a knight? Are you a soldier? Are you just like a random brawler? How do you see yourself? Based on that, someone who is a knight is going to want to deal with heroism or dueling or questions of honor, and they'll probably be a little bit more interested in politics. Someone who's a brawler is going to be interested in sizing. They're going to be more invested in nitty gritty. Tavern brawlers, gangsters, stuff like that. That's going to be really engaging to them because they made a character. The player made a decision to build a character who would feel at home with those characters, those types of characters in those scenarios, like a tavern brawl, that sort of thing. So they probably are interested in that. Cleric. Clerics are usually really interested in anything that has to do with their god or any deity that is naturally opposed to their god. Some gods don't have like an explicit, this is my nemesis god. In that case, you can also do with things like undead or things that are corrupting spirits and stuff like that. So clerics are usually super interested in that. Just because your characters are naturally supposed to be invested in that. Other quick shorthand is alignment's an okay one. It doesn't give you a whole lot, partially because players frequently treat alignment as something they are supposed to have, rather than something they actively want to have. They are not playing into the idea of being a good character so much as they are checking a box during character creation. If they are actively invested in the idea of being, say, lawful good, dilemmas involving player choice and stuff, player choice specifically between law and being a good person, and the where's the divide between that and walking that line. That's a struggle that lawful good characters have to deal with a lot, that usually players enjoy if it's done well. Other examples, wizards, sorcerers, druids, basically any spellcasting class is going to be interested in new magic stuff or weird magic stuff. If you're like, hey, this magic's acting really weirdly, or hey, this crystal's glowing purple and you can hear voices calling it from out of it, they're probably going to be engaged in that. Now, the fighter and rogue might be like, well, fuck that, we are running away from the scary, creepy magic thing. But someone who is naturally more magical and talented as a character, or magically inclined, is going to be interested in that. Does that help any? At all?
Yeah, a little. In my situation too, what I'm trying to do is make submissions and just have them be flexible so I can adjust per group.
Oh, cool.
So in situations like that, I'm just going to have to kind of leave it.
Okay, so with that, because I have also done that, you have an idea of what each tier is going to be, yeah?
Yeah, so far it's been low tier. I'll give you an example. Like, I have this scripted thing where the dude from the war room, the NPC, takes guild members out low-level ones to show them the ropes, basically give them a tour of the town. And it's basically in the disguise of like he's getting them to like run his errands. He tries to make the items sound way cooler than they actually are. And it's an indirect way to get them to know, oh, this is the temple. Come here if someone kicks the bucket, or
Your old pet project.
The libraries where you go to look up stuff, use your guild ring to do yada yada yada. And I had them just do stuff like, oh, get the mythical box that smells like fruit from the bakery, but don't open it. He tells them not to open it.
Yeah.
And it's just, that was like, I knew a character had a bakery in the upper district, so I plugged him in just because. And little stuff like that. Like, the first group I tried it on, they liked it because it showed them, what stuff was where. Mm-hmm. And then the second group was people who, I tried to feel it out. It was people who, who've been on the server for a while and they're just playing different characters. So I started it and I'm like, I was getting the feeling that they were just wanting to do a fight. So I'm like, all right, I skipped to the fight part.
So with that, when players aren't interested in learning about the locations, make the people more interesting. If they're not into it from the base premise, you can exaggerate some of the personalities involved. I don't know from the fruit box, who's the seller there? What's their base personality?
Well, it wasn't a character of mine, so I didn't want to take full reins of plan. I kind of wanted to just, that was just I wouldn't say shameless plug because it was in my shop. I was just trying to send people his way so he could maybe engage with other characters. So it wasn't a character of mine. It was a character that someone else made. I didn't want to control him.
Oh, okay. You can also make another one or send to another area. So if something I would do for that is have that particular errand to be something that's, say, the second scene rather than the first or third. You have a bunch of different shops with different NPCs and one NPC per shop, and you send them to a shop based on what you think they're going to enjoy more. Are they going to enjoy the person who is in a rough part of town and maybe is getting robbed in the middle as they show up? So if they want to fight, they get to fight some baddies nearby, and they get to help him out and simultaneously get some role playing in. Because you can do motivations for the gangsters or whoever's beating him up and robbing from him. You get to have some fun roleplay with that character as they're being robbed and then rescued. You could have a character who is more goofy and funny, someone that is a little out there, maybe not entirely sane. And for players that seem to be memeing a bit or laughing at jokes and really kind of want to have they're in it for a laugh. That will make that more interesting to them, is if you give them a character who's going to provide some opportunities for that. And for characters who want more serious adventure, this is beneath us. Honestly, actually, for those type of people, I'd also send them to rescue the person who's getting robbed. That'll engage them in the moment, and they get to feel like heroes. Hey, we actually did something helpful. Even if we're just given the tour today, we still helped someone who's being robbed, right? And I don't know what you have for the final fight, but if this is a precursor to the fight, it'll still, those kind of variations can help a little.
Well, I try to write it in a way that anything goes. The usual fight for this one is they just go out and there's a ranger character who teaches them exploration basics. But, I mean, that could happen. Something like that could happen anytime. I changed it up to maybe they'll encounter beasts or bandits, or it really depends. If they're really buying into the exploring the town, I could do something like that and throw in your idea to throw in something different.
Yeah, if they're into like exploring the town, also have a couple of other like extra locations that have more personality than what the character has been giving, like more specific. So say like make up a neighborhood that is say specifically say a neighborhood where furbolgs live in the city. Like that's a weird, interesting thing. That's not going to be super common and gives like, oh, in addition to learning the general character of Remnant, we also have a couple specific things that were weird and interesting and we go back to. Or a shop where the door changes, say a magic shop in the middles where the door changes locations in the shop every time they go through. So sometimes the door is on the roof. Sometimes it's partially stuck into the ground and they have to like crawl through. Like something like that. Maybe. Okay. I mean, you'll probably come up with better ideas for yourself or things that you feel more comfortable running on your own. But those are like what I would do on the spot right now. At least what's coming to mind.
You came out with something pretty intricate on the spot. So don't sell yourself short.
That's actually moves into our next topic, which is ways to adapt, because part of the free-form nature of a tabletop RPG is that players are going to make choices you do not know how to deal with. You did not think of them, and there are too many points of choice, because almost every moment of the game is technically a point of choice, just most of them being fairly low on the scale, as I was discussing earlier. The ability to adapt really quickly largely depends on what you know already and what you have prepared. Now, that doesn't mean you need to know everything. For example, I don't know, when I'm running a session, I don't actually have where everyone is going to be planned out for every moment of the session. I do, however, know the personality and like average daily routine of all my characters, of all my NPCs. And so at any moment in time when I'm like, oh, hey, it's noon, you guys wanted to go to the bar, these are the characters who'd be there, that sort of thing. And I also treat locations like that. I treat locations, in particular locations that are full of people, such as towns, say a bar. I treat those as NPCs in the sense of I should know them and their average routines as much as I know my NPCs. So if I know, hey, this is a small fishing village, okay, I can extrapolate from there when on the spot. When I'm asked, hey, is there a tanner nearby? I can go, yeah, but he's actually over there. Tanner, and a weird thing specifically that I can extrapolate from, like, oh, this is a small fishing village. Fishing villages tend to smell. They tend to reek because, like, you're gutting fish, you're bringing a lot of them. They smell really bad. Tanners, as a profession, which tanners being the people who turn, like, animal skin into leather, deal with leather vats, or tanning vats, all day in, day out. They usually reek. They're hated by most people. Not hated, because they perform an unnecessary role. They are not... they are not usually the people who everyone goes to, who has a lot of friends, that sort of thing, because they reek. In a fishing village, Tanner's doesn't smell that much worse than anyone else. So in this case, the Tanner might actually be more important than normal, which would be a weird reversal for any player who happens to be familiar with that particular piece of medieval European lore or life. I can also be like, they probably have a bar, but it's not like when you walk in, there's not going to be a ton of people here unless the fishing boats just got back. But fishing villages tend to be real hard drinkers, but they also are not ones that have constant flow into the bar. Because fishing fleets go out for a really long period of time. So if you're part of this also involves doing some research. Like, if you're like, hey, I want to have a logging town, do some research on logging towns. Figure out what some of the unique quirks of a logging town are. And have those down as notes. Know that a lot of the people there are probably going to be stronger than normal because they're logging, so they're the average strength there is of, like, say, a commoner. A commoner in a logging town or a mining town is probably going to have an average strength of about 13. They're on the upper end, 13 to 14, with, like, 12 being the weaker end of the average miner and then 14 being the stronger end, because they're on the upper end of your average people. Your average person does take them into account when being the average, but they're the upper end of that because they deal with physical labor constantly. Just things like that are all things that you can extrapolate because you did research ahead of time and you know the basic personality of your location. With people, knowing their personality and their goals, you can end up being as reactive with them as you would be as a person or as you would be as a player character. I'm actually... I am usually, at least for the better at role-playing an NPC than I am as a player character. Because I leave a lot of holes for player characters. NPCs, I don't. I know who this person is really quickly, and I just sketch out in my head what, within moments of talking to someone, they have, do they have trouble at home? Are they married? How many siblings do they have? Like, just a couple of quick notes. And most people aren't going to usually need that information. This is what I do for me, partially because I keep all of that in my head, so I don't actually have to slow down to take notes until afterwards for a lot of that. My post-session process is usually taking notes for all the things I made up during the session. But if I say a player character is really rude to this NPC, this is an NPC that I made up on the spot, and they were just a beggar asking for food. I can be really quickly go, this is a beggar who doesn't, like, food is what is most important to them right now. They're not going to react to that. They're going to keep begging. They're going to try and be more pitiful. They're not going to be upset by this pushback right now. It's too important for that. Their goal right now is food. And if someone gives them food, then I can react really positively to that. I know who they are and what their goal is. For a more complicated example, say a villain. When I know if the players do something that is really off the wall, I can know how my villain is going to react because I know what their goals are, and they're still going to try and react to that. Their personality definitely influences that, but say this is more for combat type stuff. So if the villain is preparing for a boss fight and the player characters, having stolen 2 donkeys, drop them in via airship or zeppelin to break through the roof, then actually rappel down wearing like bunny masks. That's a really inane, weird thing. What the heck is that character going to do? If their goal right now is just to set a trap for the player characters still showed up. They might be a little... Now, if they're skittish, a little bit paranoid, this much of their plan going off the rails is going to mean they might try to run because... Oh no, not everything is not how I envisioned it. Things are going to be really weird. I need to get out of here. Or they can stay and fight if they're the person who is really stoic and just kind of not upset by this sort of stuff. And verbal commentary response to all of this. If they're skittish, they're like, what the hell is going on? I need to get out of here. A donkey! What the hell did you have a donkey? Or if they're unflappable, a little bit sassy. Oh, did you not have enough asses already? Oh well, thankfully I've prepared something like that. Like, really quick reactions based very much on the personality of that character. And that is what you have to know, mostly. For myself, I try and root myself in the mindset of those characters while I'm running them, so I say what would kind of naturally come to mind as those. But for other people, your own process might work a little different. Any questions at this point? I apologize if I've been rambling on, if I have not been entirely helpful, or not very clear. Some of this definitely I can provide more concrete examples when when responding to specifics. Thanks, August. Waiting for you to type. As for the notes above, if you have a question about those, I'll get back to that afterwards when we're done. Oh, players' personalities. Oh, planning for them. The first couple of sessions in any particular campaign are going to be largely you setting up scenarios where you are a little bit blind to them, a little bit blind to who these characters that your players are role-playing as, and taking notes, taking extensive notes. If you are running a home game, you look at backstory, you look at character notes they give you, maybe you text them a couple questions, just to try and prepare. If you are running a thing here on Remnant, sometimes ask other DMs, ask them directly, hey, or go to the search bar in Discord, search in character introduction and from that player's name. Then you can go look at any intro they gave or backstory, which will be there if they have any that are public. For example, my current character doesn't have one, but my second character does, and my original character before Doriel was, or did have a character introduction, and that was something that was sometimes useful to a DM to look for. What I usually do when I'm doing, if I have no idea whatsoever, I've never seen them roleplay, I've never seen anything at all, I will PM the players, hey, can you give me a 2-word or 2 to 3-word description of your character? And that's where I go from there. For planning, it depends on what you want out of getting a clear view of their personalities. If you could clarify what exactly you want from that, then I can perhaps give other ways of achieving that. Also, anyone else, if you have any other questions, feel free to post those or ask those, and I can get to them after August. Also, so far I've dealt with the more freeform and the way I deal with it most of the time, ways of adapting. The second way is what I'll get to after this, which is the over-preparing fashion, which I do for Remnant, but not necessarily as much for home games. Oh, way to engage the so August asked the question. I was perhaps thinking in a way you can engage the question per se, because the player is somewhat of an easy guess, but the character motivations of this particular one. So for characters, I mean, class is usually a good one. I was talking earlier before you got in here about how with Charlie about how paladins are usually super interested in anything that has to do with their order. So if you have the first quest be something that is related to something from their order, they'll be curious about that. Clerics, anything to do with their god. With wizards, basically any of the spellcasting classes are interested in cool, interesting, weird magic stuff. And during the process of that, you can throw... What I like to do is I like to have 3 sample NPCs that I throw at players. They're not specific NPCs, but they're ones that I make up for this particular scenario, but they're ones that fulfill these 3 notes. I have a straight up kind of comedic one. I have a more serious stereotypical NPC, kind of like this is the grim monotone own action hero character that is the guard captain of this area. And then I have someone who is a more nuanced character. They are going to be very reactive to whatever the players are doing, and they're going to have a wide range of emotions. They're meant to be someone who expresses a greater deal of complexity, even though they're someone that the players aren't meant to interact with for very long. This would be someone who... a drunk who gets into a fight with the player characters, then breaks down sobbing about his wife leaving him, and then also, in turn, is maybe doesn't have enough money to pay for his last beer, but so he tries to run off, something like that. Like there's a lot to unpack right there, more so than most NPCs that players will interact with. Based on players' reactions to those 3 types of things, the serious, comedic, and then way over-complex, I can get a feel for the types of NPCs people generally want to interact with. Which ones did players engage with? Did they generally like the funny bit, but not necessarily engage with the type of humor? So, okay, I want to try a different type of humor, maybe do more slapstick instead of the witty one-liner jokes, and do that instead. But having I'm going to do a couple of sample NPCs that all hit different notes and see what they engage with is in the line of a first or during the first quest, which should be focused on something I know they'll engage with. If they're all good aligned, rescuing children is a pretty simple one, or just rescuing people. If they're chaotic or neutral to evil aligned, pay, something that just pays good, and if they said they wanted a political campaign, if if their characters are rooted in the world and in-world motivations, something like political intrigue is a decent starting point. You just have to make sure that the scenario will naturally explain motivations of the factions, and they're not getting front-loaded with 5 pages of exposition, because that can break people's interest in politics, at least fantasy politics. And then Bloop, you had a question of, do you have any preferred go-to testing scenarios to get a good feel for character and player personalities? One is the one I just described, which is just throw a variety of things there. The other, which I really like, is the incompetent barmaid. Throw a character who is sympathetic, but also, or who is, broadly speaking, a little sympathetic, but also happens to have a brief, momentary negative impact on the players. They spill their beer on them. they apologize, they tripped, they're overworked, they look tired, maybe they have a couple of bruises around their neck if I really want to go really dark, or if it's a guy. I actually, half the time I prefer having it be a guy if I'm going with bruises, mostly because it plays off of some... It is a more interesting and less common variant of that stereotype and doesn't go quite as many dark places. And I can still do like, oh, they have a black eye, like maybe they're getting bruised, they're getting in fights and stuff. But see how players react. Do they give them an extra generous tip because obviously they're overworked and they're stressed and they're kind of out of their mind with a worry over too many orders, too late nights, all that sort of stuff? Do they react really, really negatively? Are they... is it a moment the players talk about? That's something I use a lot in home games. It is actually, for me, the redeeming quality of the Meet in a Tavern sequence. Because I get to do the tip the waiter scene. Or tip the incompetent barmaid. Or choose not to. Even split would be if there was only 2 reactions. I get more positive than I get negative. There's almost always one person who reacts pretty strongly negative as far as like outraged and scolding, but then gives them a couple gold anyways, like overpays, because as a player they feel bad about it, or the character is like, I'm going to be outraged, but I'll simmer down later and do something nice but not say anything about it. Because players like playing into the archetype of the bark is worse than their bite thing. But I've gotten some pretty varied reactions. Some folk, it did turn one campaign into this. I say campaign. It lasted 3 sessions, but it turned a campaign from a brief, like a goblin hunt, to a unionize the town and start a revolution for better pay thing, which my friend who is as part of that is. His dad is a union leader, and he is very pro-union. And let me just say, you should have seen that. You should have seen that coming. Or I should have. But other than that, I get go-to scenarios. Oh. Not directly personalities, but character relationships. If I have a cleric or a paladin, they're going to get a vision for from their deity, or at least in a dream sequence. Sometimes it isn't direct, sometimes, but it is a very good way for me to gauge what they, as a player, and what their character's feelings are towards their god that they might not tell me directly. I can extrapolate from how they're reacting to that, any choices they're making in the interaction between themselves and their deity. Now that can be as simple as they are having a dream about being in their deity's presence. Depending on the campaign, I usually don't go for like the vision quest thing. I save that for mid to high tier. But for them specifically, I really want to know what their interaction with that is. Also, nobility. I want to throw a noble at them really quickly. If I have nobility, if I have an aristocracy, I want to see how they react to an aristocrat, so I know ahead of time if I'm making a potential employer for them that is an aristocrat, how are they going to react to it? As an example. So those are my go-tos. My style as a DM is very much reliant on individual things that I come up with on the spot that then fill these broad places in a framework. My notes usually are very, very frameworky. I have a lot of insert sympathetic character or NPC here, or dramatic dragon, referring specifically to the TV tropes dragon, which is a second in command who's physically imposing or imposing in combat. Have a dragon who's really compelling for this fight scene, and then afterwards we'll move on to the actual boss fight, that sort of thing. But for those who want a little more preparation, and also these are things I do for a broad campaign and just edit over and over, they're just not necessarily what I choose to do for individual sessions. And for some people, these types of things go way, way better. Prepare this for preparation to deal with adapting to really interesting or weird player choices. And one, you can do flowcharts. Flowcharts are super, super helpful. You can make really, really intense flowcharts. You can make pretty basic ones. Befriend, ally, and don't make a choice. Those are 3 potential reactions to meeting a new faction, say a mercenary army. And from those 3 choices, you then lead those into a flowchart that then they can all split apart, meet up, that sort of thing. Flowcharts are incredibly helpful. Character goal notes, and I just make those pretty constantly. As players are talking about goals, what they're interested in, I take a lot of notes. I start making those. I ask questions about those, partially because those are good ways to point players in directions you would like, and therefore avoid... by point players in directions you would like, that's not meant to be malicious. That's meant to be, hey, I have things that are genuinely interesting to you as a player and to you as a character prepared here. You don't need to go herring off in all these other directions looking for something interesting, because I've actually provided you with something interesting here. And you can provide them with a couple of interesting things, and then they make choices between that. But you've prepared for both of those things, so they're good. Or so you're ready, you don't have to deal with too much adaptation. So knowing what people are going to be interested in helps you prevent people from deviating from everything you have prepared most of the time, just because you know that what you have prepared is actually interesting to them, and you know how to signpost it that it will be interesting to them. I also do roadmaps. I have... in every home game, I make a map of the world, and I make about 3 or 4 different, at least at the start, road maps, meaning physical tracking of the party's potential movement across the map. Which towns will they go to, and I make notes on each of those based on what broad choices would make them want to go in these directions, why would they deviate to going these ways, and then I'll prep... I'll pick one of those and I'll prep for, I'll start having that one as like, okay, this is my core roadmap. And then for all the other ones, I only need to prep my current, if they head that way during this session. If they want to head that way for next session, they should have signposted that to me now, or during the newest session. So I can prepare for that and go, oh, okay, this is no longer my core roadmap. This is my core roadmap. This is what I'm going with. Also, and this is for Remnant specifically, take incredibly extensive amounts of notes on basically every player and DM. You can look through session write-ups. You can look through... character introductions, you can look through, you can sit in on sessions, you can look into Guild Hall for role-playing, you can search for that player in the search bar in Discord and see what they have posted. And you can look in specific channels to try and go, hey, when was the last time you roleplayed this character? So I can go look and get a sense of this character. I have roughly 3 sentences of notes on every character in the server that I have played with or DM'd for. For some players and characters, I have a page is worth. That's a little overkill. I don't recommend that you need to do that. I've also been doing that for 6 months. So... I believe yours is, your voice is... it's basically just Muppet voice is fucking amazing, and, Grung needs moisture, do not do desert mission, moderate RP with interesting combat. Vaughn, I have not actually played with you or DM'd for you, I believe. I don't think I have notes on you. I think most of the notes for you are basically noting what happened to Vaughn, and Vaughn as a making sure I know that you used to be Vaughn. Anyways, yeah, you can go incredible overkill. Now, if you are doing that for home game, I do actually recommend making that level of notes. You are going to be dealing with a smaller pool of players. They're going to be consistent. Their characters won't die very frequently, and that's something you can just make you can add, even adding a sentence to after every session, you build up a large catalog of notes by the end of like a month or 2 months. So that can get pretty intense and pretty good. Yeah. Any other questions? I see Cherish is typing something. Oh. My apologies. Cherish said it was a comment and it's irrelevant now. So, moving on. I mean, honestly, I've tried to cover during all of this ways to adapt, ways to react to choices, ways to make players invested in things. Does anyone have questions about any of this? Because I don't have anything else planned. So we are moving into the notes only section. This will be up on YouTube afterwards. Yeah, Charlie?
No, I'll pass.
All right.
You've answered my questions already, so I think I'm good.
Cool.
I'm just taking a stab at it.
I'm just going to turn you into Rosa on your next mission as punishment.
Gross.
Just as a general note for a lot of this, and something, the fundamental thing with selling any of these selling anything you are doing to players is making it seem believable, making it seem reasonable or plausible. So figuring it, knowing their expectations is as important as trying to figure out what they want, if that makes sense. Because their expectations are not necessarily always what they want. And it also knows what bar is being set for you. Vaughn has the question of what would a good general reaction or response, or a couple of general ones, from a DM when a player in the party is heading way off track be? Well, depends on what you mean by off track. If they're heading away from what you have prepared, do you have something that is interesting that you can come up with as a reaction to that? For example, if I briefly mentioned during the description of the party, and the party is going into the city to go meet with the mayor, okay? They want to head into the uppers, the rich area. I briefly mentioned the slums off to the west, and the rogue says he wants to go over to the slums. All right, because he is a rogue, I can already think of 3 separate, and knowing he's a kind of a good guy rogue, actually. Like, he's a rogue more so in that he has those skills more so than the mentality. He's not a thief. He's someone who was forced to be a pickpocket for a while, but got out of that life. He's done with it, and he has a heart for common folks. So if I have there be a couple of poor folk that need some help, that's going to be an interesting side scene for him. And also I can have him be jumped by thugs who want to know what the new kid's doing in town, that sort of thing. I have interesting responses. So my general philosophy being, the game is what happens. The game is not what I intended. The game is not what players intended. The game is what happens. And the story is what happens. That's not a detour in my mind. Now, if he is heading in the direction of something where I don't think there's anything interesting for him, I can say I can have other players in the party make a perception check to try and say, hey, where are you going? We're heading this way. Come on, we've got to meet the mayor. And one of the other players is going to do my job for me of trying to get them back on track. If they are doing something that the rest of the party is not enjoying, it is a sidetrack in the sense of we are focusing on one player or a couple of players, and everyone else is not really getting to do much because there's nothing here interesting for them. I have 2 responses. I can either say, hey, and out of character I can say, hey, it seems like this is super fun for you, but not as much for everyone else. So I'm going to keep going with this, but we're going to try and wrap it up and get to a point where everyone else can be engaged with this as well. Or what I can do as an alternative is I can just try and adjust the scenario to give everyone else an opportunity to join in. For example, if that party happens to have a ranger, cleric, and a fighter, and I know the fighter was an ex-gladiator, the cleric is a cleric of Ilmater, the god of the martyr, and the ranger just generally is hardy type, outdoorsy type, but has a soft spot for animals. The rogue can come back with, hey, there's someone who needs healing. For the cleric, it's a gladiator. Or who was injured it's a gladiator who was injured in his most recent bout. That gladiator character who's now been the fighter, the ex-gladiator, now is interested because it's another gladiator. They have a connection to this. The ranger can also generally be interested in the type of people that would be in this area, and potentially you can throw in some like hurt animal needs help or something along those lines to grab them if it doesn't seem like they're interested in the rest of the hooks you've thrown. If they're heading way off track and it's a messing with timing thing, which I know is a problem here on Remnant because we don't particularly do multi-part sessions very frequently, then you can say, hey, we're kind of getting a little off track. I'm going to try and I know we have a time limit, so let's try and whatever that is they're doing, I'll try to give a quick wrapping up of that. For example, if they're going and trying to talk to an NPC, that NPC is going to be interested in what they have to say. Shove off, I don't have time to talk to tourists, I'm too busy. Yeah, I've got somewhere to be. is like a random NPC example. Stuff like that is a good way to shut that down, and then also out of character be, hey, we're on a time limit. If you guys could get back on this, just so I just know one of you is going to have to go in a bit, and I want to make sure we can get you through everything I had, the experience I had planned for you during this. Does that answer your question, Vaughn? Awesome. No problem. Anyone else have any questions? I know this has been really long-winded. I hope people found something useful out of this rambling and my notes. For those who aren't here for part of it or for most of it, the recording will go up on the Remnant YouTube when we're done. Link will be provided here as usual, and yeah, with that, give another couple minutes for anyone who has questions. I'm flattered, but I think you would get sick of my voice at some point. I'm get sick of it pretty easily. I hate any time I have reverb back through my own mic. Well, my biggest notes on players are mostly just who wants RP, who wants combat, who is interested, who prefers original lore versus traditional D&D lore. And CR how they adjust the level of the party. For example, most of the power gamers on the server, I have notes on if they are in a party, adjust the party to have an extra, as if that character is 1 to 2 levels higher. That sort of note keep. I also have, like, for example, Michaela. Michaela's really not optimized. I don't mind that. I just know I have to prepare for it. She's really low on health, so I have a note in there when I'm prepping for preparing for combat encounters to say, hey, don't do anything with super high burst damage if it's going to be area of effect. Hey, treat that character as, I believe I have her as 2 levels lower, and because that bit is because she has the health of a much lower level character, as well as 0 offensive spells. She's basically just a heal bot. So that character I have to treat with differently. I also have a note on any cleric of, like, I just have any player, I just have the note cleric in there. But what that means to me is if I throw undead at them, be aware that they have turn undead, and be aware they deal radiant damage. And a lot of times that's going to change the difficulty of the encounter I throw at them. That also means sometimes, that doesn't mean I'll never throw undead at a cleric. That means if I do, I'm going to reduce the XP I give them because they are not facing the challenge level that they would normally get. Throwing things that are, well, if I do throw a lot of undead, I'm usually throwing a lot of low CR undead, in which case a lot of low CR undead means turn undead is actually way more powerful because you can insta-kill a bunch of people. I am not a believer in the idea of don't throw players at what they're really good at or what they're really weak at. I think that both things should occur. They should occur rarely. They should occur, the latter of throwing players against what they're really weak at should occur when you have an intelligent enemy who has had time to study and research them. And throwing players at what they're good at sometimes just means the party has correctly anticipated the general theme of the campaign, in which case like, if I'm going for an aquatic campaign and players take things that are necessarily good at aquatic stuff, or say I'm going if I'm going against, or if I say, hey, a Lich is the big bad of this campaign, and they spec for being anti-undead, that's okay. They correctly anticipated that. They built for that. I just have to be conscious of that as a DM and prepare for that. That I don't want to negate their build choices, because your build as a player is a choice, and one that should matter, because you're making pretty significant and usually permanent mechanical changes to your character. So if you never throw them at what they're good at because they built against that, you're negating their choice. You aren't treating it as having weight. Yeah. Any other questions? So basically you do you and let the players manage with the monsters with the mind of their strengths and weaknesses. Yeah, August, that is a bit of it. I definitely... So Tad covered this more extensively in his DM workshop, but a huge part of combat encounter design is the environment. With that in mind, it is part of that is paths the enemies have to you or you have to the enemies, so choke points or lack thereof. Terrain, height, and height is less important in 5th edition. In other editions, it used to be way more important. But also things like difficult terrain, or area of effect like damage, like, hey, lava is beneath you and it's occasionally bubbling up and dealing damage in a random square, stuff like that. Those things do... I also build those things with players in mind about the same amount as I do anything else. And yeah, Vaughn just said it right before I got to it. This is also partially why I'm really bad at building battle maps. I am too reactive when it comes to that. I have a general idea of the layout of a location and of a region. Where players are when they end up in the fight, unless they're ending up at a fixed location, say they're going to a fortress or the enemy camp. But even the enemy camp, they can fight pickets. They could scare the enemy away from the camp and then catch them as they're running. All sorts. There's so many different variables there that I usually don't draw the map beforehand. I wait till, all right, you guys are here? Okay, give me 5 minutes while we have our little snack break, and everyone goes use the bathroom while I prep the battle map based on that. For Remnant, what that translates to is theater of the mind, almost exclusively. Unless I'm dealing with the epic tier, in which case I really, really want to have a battle map, so I usually build 3. And end up using 1. Just because epic tier has a lot of area of effect abilities, they have they have a lot of movement, and positioning is really important for so much of their abilities that I really need to be able to position around. I can't keep track of all that in my head as much. Yes, Emerald, I do the 3 as a just in case to switch between. Similar to the roadmap I was talking about earlier, where I draw out on maps where I think players are going to go, and I have the core one, which is I'm aiming for this one. This is where I think players will go, and this is the one I'm going to try to push towards. The other two are essentially like, okay, these are two potential outcomes I have thought of that seem relatively likely, and I can push towards as alternatives if they don't seem to be liking the primary thing. If players are really, really against fighting the vampire in his lair, I can set up for example, I can set up the mansion around his crypt, and also the house that is the woman they are trying to protect by killing the vampire. I can set up that as another location because they might just try and defend there and catch him as he comes in, rather than being more proactive. That's one example. For what Emerald was doing with Emerald's experience with the Twilight Roost epic tier corrupted dragon turtle BBS fight, I had a specific location in mind for where that would mostly occur, but because there was a river, there was a current, I had two more maps, both of which were just further downriver from there, based on whether or not the current ended up being more important, or a lot of other factors, none of which ended up happening because most people stayed out of the water or could fly, and Emerald turned into another dragon turtle, so current wasn't as much of an issue. And again, I only make the 3 for, like, epic tier. For low, mid, and high, I tend to just do Theater of the Mind. For home games, I draw the map. When combat starts, we take our break, and I draw a map real quick. Because my home games run a little long, all my games run a little long, so I try to have a break in the middle. Bathroom, etc. Bathroom breaks are important. It depends on the edition or system. For 5th edition, if I have notes on the players, and I have a general idea of what they would like, it takes me an hour. If I try to do puzzles, not just like skill challenges, but specifically like logic puzzles, stuff like that, things you would find in a puzzle game, then it will take me sometimes up to 3 hours, because I would say I am okay at designing them, I just take a while. I do it for one of my part-time jobs because I work in an escape room, but I'm just kind of meticulous and it takes a while. And the ones I'm most familiar with, I need to make sure players have certain knowledge, and sometimes that's something I can't rely on. For a 4th edition game, I can prep that in about 4th edition game that is in a homebrew world. I can prep that in 30 minutes. In a Pathfinder game, I will prep that usually in about 2 hours. An hour of that is doing combat stuff because Pathfinder has a lot more fiddly bits. I also usually do a refresher on some of the weird rules I know in Pathfinder I'm going to be needing during that fight. And other weird additions, like it kind of depends. Like a Star Wars thing, that usually takes me about 4 hours because I do a crazy amount of rereading of those rules because a huge portion of those don't make sense to me. So I need to reread the combat stuff over and over again to refresh. If I'm running Iron Kingdoms, which is this weird steampunk fantasy thing where everyone is multi-classed. For example, you start with 2 classes, so you could be, say, a noble and a highwayman, or you could be, say, a military officer pirate, or you could be a arcane mechanic gun mage, or like a sniper ranger, a sorcerer mage hunter, a duelist knight. Like, seriously, they have 20 base classes and several books with more classes. It's an insane system. I really like it. That one also takes about 2 hours. So, here, I'll type it out. It is Iron Kingdoms. IRON space Kingdoms. It is the tabletop RPG that is based off of the world of the war games Hordes and War Machines. Now, it started as a 4th edition setting, but it was released as its own thing after they eventually kind of moved on and made the war games, which are really popular and pretty good. They're not spectacularly cheap. They're not as expensive as any of the Warhammer stuff or Age of Sigmar. They're not Games Workshop expensive, but they're fun. I have models for one of them. I still need to assemble them. But I ran a mercenary campaign in that. That was a ton of fun. They have They have weird things like beardless dwarves, goblins that aren't the monsters that everyone goes to kill. Stuff like that. So from Vaughn, for missions, I honestly just choose a few different models that I can have them fight, have at least one of them be what I want them to fight. Then I kind of am up with a sort of concept of what the story or happenings of the mission will be. I have no notes on players. I was asked for players' HP and AC at least, though. So I know if I need to maybe attack player more or less. Mostly I just think of the beginning and end goal and set up at least 2 or more encounters that have at some point in the middle just coming up on the fly for the most part. My missions are mostly improv. Haha, I have a hard time taking notes and doing extensive planning, etc. that you do. Sorry. Yeah, I'm mostly improv too. As much as I talk about the note stuff, a huge part of that is just me knowing what I am, knowing players and knowing my NPCs. I write down a lot of stuff after a session based on what I prepped or what I improv during, but for several missions I have ran here, some ones which got really RP intensive, the only notes I had written down were 3 names and 3 names in the stat blocks for combat stuff. That isn't to say I don't plan, but I just don't write down a lot of it because it has to be a little freeform. And yeah, so I described 2 ways of doing the prep work, of being, or not 2 ways of doing the prep work, 2 ways of being able to react, to be prepared for weird choices, for things that you didn't anticipate. And one of those involves a lot of pre-session prep time, and the other involves just a lot of memorization. So it depends on which works for you. And sometimes that'll vary. Remnant was a crash course in doing a lot of improv, because players constantly did things I didn't expect, separate from how I had done it before, as well as I couldn't take as extensive notes on players as I did everyone else, as far as like keeping all that in my head. That's why I have such extensive written notes on players, is because that's not something I can keep in my head on a server this size. Now, for a home game, I can. And yeah, it's just stuff like that. And also doing a lot of research on weird things. Like, I know I have a fishing village. I'm going to go look up a lot of weird facts about random fishing villages in the 1300s or so. So, closing up in just a moment. Anyone have questions before I close for the day?
I'm good.
The bugbear monologue is coming to a close. Yeah, Cherish? What question do you have? So, three broad types of that would be character, scene, and and location. So, character, improv, and because these all take a little bit different types of. So, Cherish's question to read aloud to those who won't be seeing this: how to improve at the flexibility and quickness of doing improv. There's three broad types of improvisation you're doing that take different types of practice. So, character improv. This is when an NPC that you are playing needs to do something that is improv and you didn't plan. Improv classes are actually super helpful. The quickness and flexibility bit of that is just if you do a lot of doing word games with friends, doing word games where you need to respond quickly and with a joke, things that are like really quick back and forth. Those are great. Also, if you are doing something where you are basing characters off of established characters in fiction, for example, you were doing a Star Wars game and you want to have Darth Vader and Princess Leia and all of that. If you can do a lot of so doing like quote games where you're doing that, or quizzes like, hey, what would Darth Vader do? Like things like they're cheesy, but they do work. They help you get into a mindset of a character. For scenes, scene being when players are doing something weird and you need to improv the narrative description of what the world is doing in reaction to them. This isn't necessarily NPCs doing it specifically. This is like, hey, I want to throw a donkey at the roof. We have a catapult, so I guess you can do that. With that, sometimes you can just ask them to take a moment and wait. For improving with that, is Mad Libs is what I did a lot of. I did a whole lot of Mad Libs or games where someone starts a story and then you finish it. Or they're like campfire games where it's, hey, one person does a sentence and then they leave an and question and then pass it off to another. Doing a ton of those helped me. And also doing... I can't promise that this is all going to work for everyone. I'm not professional for this. This is what helped me specifically improve. And also looking up some basic stuff of physics / biology stuff. For locations, this is when, hey, they're heading to a place I did not anticipate. Making yourself... so one of those is just reading up on different types of terrain. So you have general descriptions of a lot of different types of regions. This is why I spend sometimes like 30 minutes at 2 a.m. looking up savannas or swamps. You can look up different types of architecture and just read those. If you have a broad knowledge base of a lot of different types of locations, that helps with that. And then with that, it's also having broad notes for the types of things this is at. If you have the note of, say, for example, I could say remnant architecture is mostly Roman or Roman-inspired. That means anytime I have to describe a new building, I can generally think to what I know about Roman architecture, what it looks like, and say, hey, it has all these features, or hey, use that as a mental foundation, if that makes any sense. Is that helpful at all? Awesome. And yeah, Vaughn, we would love to do some of those games here. I've been wanting to run or do Jackbox Party Pack games here for a while, and some of those party games are legitimately stuff that made me better at certain types of, at least the variants I played with friends. If you are doing fibbage and each of you are given a character that you have to respond to every question as, that makes it a very fun game. Stuff like that. And yeah, apples to apples and things like that. D&D and stuff like that are sometimes feel like apples to apples or Cards Against Humanity's cards where all of the white cards are write your own. So yeah. And then also with locations, just having broad notes about the type of region they're in. So you're like, hey, there's a river to the south. Stuff like that. I usually try to have like a 3-mile radius around wherever they're... 3-mile radius beyond wherever I expect them to wander to actually be somewhat mapped out. Now, I won't know every tree or location in there, but I can always do, oh, hey, you're in a random dell, that sort of thing. So. All right. Waiting for Cherish to finish typing, and then it'll be last chance for questions. And I will close up, as this has gone on almost 3 hours. And I just checked, I did in fact record this. All right. And sorry, Vaughn, I'm probably going to crash after this. I was going to run a null mission after this, but I did not have sufficient time to prep for this workshop, so some of my stuff here. And also, I remember your recent experience with nulls, so I figure you wouldn't actually want to. All right, thank you very much for coming, everyone. Hope that answers some questions. Feel free to PM me. My current characters are Doriel and Myra, and the Discord name is just Felhawk. So, See you later.
See ya.